Titanic. In April 1912, the Titanic arrived in Southampton in the south of England. Everyone was excited about the new ship. It was the biggest ship in the world, the most beautiful, perhaps the fastest, and it was much safer than older ships because it had 16 compartments with emergency doors. The new ship had radio too. Passengers could send messages from the ship to their friends at home. Captain Smith and his officers and sailors were ready. Then the passengers came. Millionaires, young people, families of 6, people from more than 40 different countries. Many of them wanted to begin a new life in America. So the Titanic went to Cherbourg in France, then Queenstown in Ireland, and then left for New York. There were 2,224 people on the ship, but there were lifeboats for only half of them. But that did not matter. The Titanic was unsinkable. Under the sea. It was the 1st of September 1985 under a ship in the North Atlantic. A camera moved through the dark water slowly. The camera went down 1,000 meters, 2,000 meters, 3,000 meters under the sea. On the ship, some sailors waited and watched. Nobody spoke. Then, suddenly, they saw something. The Titanic, 1985. There it is. Where? There. Look, I can see it. Yes, you're right. It is the Titanic. With the camera, the sailors could see a ship 3,810 meters under the water. It was a very big, old ship, and it was in 2 halves. They could see the front half of the ship with their camera, but the back half of the ship was 800 meters away. The sailors were all very happy. They took lots of photographs. The next year, they came back with more cameras. The cameras went down under the sea and looked at the ship more carefully. They went all around the ship and took hundreds of photos. Some of the cameras went into the ship too, through the windows. Later, there was a film about the ship. People all over the world watched the film and saw the photographs in newspapers. But who built the Titanic? What happened to it? Why did it break in 2 halves and sink to the bottom of the sea? And what about the people on the ship? What were they like and what happened to them? This is the story of the Titanic, the biggest ship in the world. More than 15,000 people built the Titanic in Belfast, Northern Ireland. They began building it in 1909 and finished it in 1912. The Titanic was the biggest ship in the world, 46,328 tons, 265 meters long, and 28 meters across. It had 3 big engines, and it could go at 23 knots, 46 kilometers per hour. So, it was one of the fastest ships in the world too. The Titanic was very safe. It had 16 compartments and 15 emergency doors. When the captain closed the emergency doors, water could not move from one compartment to the next one. The new Titanic is much a first-class lounge safer than older ships. A newspaper said the Titanic was a very beautiful ship. The rooms for the first-class passengers, like Mr. and Mrs. John Jacob Astor IV, were like rooms in a very expensive hotel. John Jacob Astor was one of the richest men in the world. He was 47 years old, but his second wife, Madeline, was only 18. On the ship, Mr. and Mrs. Astor had 2 big bedrooms, a sitting room, and 3 more rooms. Mr. Astor and his young wife could eat in the beautiful restaurant and talk to rich famous people like Benjamin Guggenheim, an American businessman colonel, Archibald Gracie, a soldier and writer, and Mr. Isidor Straus, a businessman from New York, with his wife Ida. The captain of the Titanic, Edward Smith, came to eat with them too. There were many more rooms for the first-class passengers. There they could walk, read, smoke, and listen to music. The rooms for the second-class passengers were beautiful too. They were better than the first-class rooms on most ships, but most of the passengers had third-class tickets. These people were not rich, they were working people from England, Ireland, and many more countries. Carla Jensen was a 19-year-old girl from Denmark, and Anna Toria was 18 and from Finland. These 2 young women wanted to begin a new life in America. Third-class passengers had small rooms called cabins on E-deck, a long way under the first-class and second-class passengers. There were 4 beds in every cabin. Sometimes the first-class passengers walked their dogs on E-deck because it had the longest corridors on the ship. But they did not talk to the third-class passengers. They had nothing to say to them. A city on the sea. On 10 April 1912, the Titanic left Southampton in the south of England. The ship went to Cherbourg in France, and then to Queenstown near the city of Cork in Ireland. A lot of third-class passengers got on here. Then the Titanic went west towards New York. On Sunday, 14 April, Colonel Gracie got up early. He had breakfast, finished reading a book, and talked to his friends Mr. and Mrs. Strauss. On the boat deck, Mrs. Astor talked to Thomas Andrews, the designer of the Titanic. "I know all about this ship," he said. "Do you have any questions, Mrs. Astor?" "Yes," she said. "How many people are there on this ship?" Thomas Andrews took a book out of his pocket. "Let me see. There are 325 first-class passengers like us, 277 second-class passengers, 706 third-class passengers, 908 officers and sailors, and 8 musicians. My goodness, we are like a small city, aren't we?" Mrs. Astor put her hand on a small boat on the side of the ship. "How many of these lifeboats are there?" 20. 20? Mrs. Astor said. "But can all those people get into 20 lifeboats?" "No, of course not," Thomas Andrews said quietly. "But don't be afraid, Mrs. Astor. We don't really need the lifeboats, because the Titanic can never sink. It is the safest ship in the world."